Good day and welcome to Eau Claire Evangelical Missionary Church. Today we're going through the first message for our Advent series this year. As we were lighting the Advent candle, this is what we were reading from 2 John chapter, well, there is no chapter in 2 John, but 2 John verse 3. It is, may God the Father and Jesus Christ, the Father Son, give us grace, mercy, and peace, and may they be ours in truth and love. Today we were focusing specifically on the word grace, and that word grace that's represented in the lit candle behind me specifically has to do with God's power, his divine influence, motivating and engaging and helping us to take part in actions that reflect Jesus Christ. So it's God's grace that helps us say no to sin. It's God's grace that helps us to be loving to people that perhaps we don't want to be loving to, or just to be loving as Jesus is loving. It's God's grace that helps us to engage in prayer and faith and see God move throughout this world. So that's where we began today, but now we're going to get into the message. And as we get into this series for Advent, because Advent is almost always a series of some kind, as we prepare our hearts for Jesus' birth, and we celebrate that on Christmas Eve, we are this year looking at 5 words, actually 6. They're all question words. We will be going through who, what, when and where, why, and how. And all of these words are going to be covered in the next series of messages. Today, we are specifically looking at the who of Advent. Today, actually, the passages contain quite a bit of theology on the incarnation of Christ. And what does that mean? Well, that means God became a human and lived as one of us. He became the Emmanuel, which is how Isaiah puts it, which is God with us. And the thing about these passages is they also let us know that yes, Jesus came into a specific time in history to be born and live as a human being, but that doesn't limit him. He has always been. So as we read through John and we read through Colossians, we'll find out that Jesus has always been there, but now because he came and stepped into time, we can have a connection with God that just wasn't there before. And also, the analogy I used for this message that we talk about, it's very similar to the story of, well, it's Rocky Balboa. And it's like, well, how does Rocky fit into Advent? Well, the movie Rocky was originally written by Sylvester Stallone. And he went to many studios and pitched this story. And a lot of people were like, this is a great movie. This would be awesome. But he also said, I need to be in it. I'm the starring role. And a lot of people are like, well, nobody knows who you are. Forget it. We need a supreme A-list actor to do this. That's actually similar to what Jesus did. Rocky became a success. Sylvester Stallone also became a success. But Jesus is like that author who is writing the story. And then suddenly he steps into the story, becomes the hero, and changes the course of the rest of the story. That's really what Jesus did when he came. He stepped into the story of history and changed everything. Let's start by reading John chapter 1. And we're going to be reading not the whole chapter. We're going to stop in around verse 18. But this gives us a picture from John's perspective. Remember, John is like one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples, of who Jesus is as he stepped into history. John 1, verse 1. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. From the very beginning, the Word was with God. Through him, God made all things. Not one thing in all creation was made without him. The Word was the source of life, and this life brings light to humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never put it out. God sent his messenger, a man named John, not the writer of John, but John the Baptist, who came to tell the people about that light, that they should all hear the message and believe. He himself was not the light, but he came to tell about that light. And this is the real light, the light that comes into the world and shines on everyone. The Word was in the world, and though God made the world through him, yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own country, but his own people didn't receive him. But some did receive him and believed in him, and he gave them the right to become God's children. They did not become God's children by natural means, that is, by being born of children of a human father. God himself was their father. Here's the crux of what today's message is about. It's about the who of Advent, and this is who we are talking about when we talk about Christmas. The Word became a human being, full of grace and truth, and lived among us. We saw his glory, the glory which he received as God the Father's only Son. John the Baptist spoke about him. He cried out, "This is the one I was talking about when I said, 'He comes after me, but he's greater than I am because he existed before I was born.'" And out of the fullness of his grace, he's blessed us all, giving one blessing after another. God gave the law through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only Son, who has the same as God and is the Father's side. He has made God the Father known to us. So as we go through this passage, we just think and we go, wow, so Jesus has always been there, and yet he came, wasn't even recognizable because humanity had drifted so far from God that they didn't even recognize him. Not even his own people. The Israelites had drifted. Now, we have to think, this is a religious time period for the Israelites. We had people like the Pharisees who were in leadership positions within the Israelite society, and they did everything that they thought possible to follow God. They made up rules, up top of rules, just so you wouldn't be offensive to God and you wouldn't sin. But they had completely lost the relationship with God to the point that they didn't recognize Jesus. And eventually, they were involved in killing Jesus because they didn't recognize who God really is. But Jesus shows us who God is. Also, one of the really interesting parts of this passage is the part near the end where John says, God gave the law through Moses. So Moses gave the law to show us the attributes and what God is like. God is like no other. That's why we don't have any God other than him, because he's like no other. At the same time, God is, we think of it, let's just go back to the Ten Commandments. We think, does God steal? No, God doesn't steal. Does God murder? No, God does not, with intention, specifically go out and I'm going to get that guy for no reason. No, God does not murder. There's always some sort of reason. There's always a plan, and there's almost always sin as to why people are getting judged. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's not an almost always, it's an always. At the same time, we see God, he doesn't covet. He doesn't want what other gods are offering. He doesn't want other people. He wants us in relationship with him. So he's not about to betray us like a husband betraying a wife or vice versa. He's not going to betray us. In fact, 2 Timothy says, even if we are faithless, he still remains faithful because that's just who he is. So all that information came from Moses. So Moses gives us all the information, all the law. And some of those are ceremonial laws, some of those are ritual laws, some of those are legal laws for the ancient Israelite people, and some of those are moral laws that still really connect today. But you can't fulfill it. The people of Israel did not have the ability to fulfill the law. That's where that word grace and truth, this combination, come into play. So grace is the ability to actually do what the law says. And truth is, we get it. We understand why God's put some of these things in place. So grace and truth are not just about following the rules. They're about, or even doing them. It's about connecting to God. So now we are able to represent Jesus here on earth. And that comes only through Jesus Christ. Another passage that we can look at to see how, or actually, no, we're looking at who of Christmas. We can see Jesus in Colossians. The second half of the first chapter of Colossians, what we would call the first chapter. It's early in his letter. And after his greeting and his prayer for the people of Colossae, this church that might only have been of 40 or 50 people in a small backwater town, the one that people had forgotten about. That's some of the descriptions that we have historically of Colossae. He shares this powerful set of words describing who Jesus is, which again is our main message for Advent today. Christ in Colossians chapter 1, beginning in verse 15. Christ is the visible likeness of the invisible God. So anytime we see God show up as a human in the Old Testament, they would call that a Christophany, but that's the same thing here. He is visible to us here on this earth as a person. That's Jesus. So he's always been here. He's shown up several times. And he's the firstborn son, superior to all created things. So he's better than anything that's ever been created. For through him, God created everything in heaven and on earth, the seen and the unseen things, including spiritual powers, lords, rulers, and authorities. God created the whole universe through him and for him. Just an aside, this kind of gets my brain going, thinking a little bit sci-fi and comic book. I've read a lot of sci-fi novels recently. Even the multidimensional universe, which is like, what do you mean multidimensional? Well, there's such a thing as the spirit realm where there's angels and demons. And it says here, Christ is behind all those things. In fact, he's bigger than all these things. For through him, God created everything in heaven and earth, the seen and the unseen things, including spiritual powers, lords, rulers, authorities. God created the whole universe through him and for him. Christ existed before all things, and in union with him, all things have their proper place. He is the head of the body, the church. So he's the top of the church. He is the one that gives us the commands. That's what the head does. It commands the rest of the body. But he's also the source of the body's life. He is the firstborn son, the preeminent one, who is raised from death, in order that he alone might have first place in all things. For it was by God's own decision that the Son has in himself the full nature of God, and through the Son, then God decided to bring the whole universe back to himself. God made peace through his Son's blood on the cross, so he brought back to himself all things, both on earth and in heaven. You see, everything was drifting further and further away from God since the moment Adam and Eve decided to become independent of him and choose to understand and act on good and evil, because that was the temptation. It was the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. They knew about the good. They knew God, but not the evil. And as they partook in that, they rebelled. And ever since then, things have been breaking down and drifting further away. And yet God says that he himself, through Jesus Christ, brought everything back. This is who we're talking about throughout the Advent season. Not just a little baby born in a manger, but this is who he is. He's so much more than just those images. So he brought back to himself all things, both on earth and in heaven. At one time, now it gets personal. At one time, you were far away from God and were his enemies because of the evil things you did and thought. It's not just our actions that God's looking at. He's also checking out our thoughts. But now, by means of the physical death of his Son, God has made you his friends in order to bring you pure, holy, and faultless into his presence. Now, it was just American Thanksgiving, and in many places, this would be the first time that somebody brings someone else home to introduce them to the family. You know, you get that young fellow or that that young girl who's bringing home for the first time their boyfriend or the fiance, and they're going to introduce them to the family. And so all families have quirks, and at the same time, it can be a really nerve-wracking time. And you might feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to measure up to this family. Well, we have that in Jesus, except he's the one that brings us in, and he is the one that presents us. We don't present ourselves as holy, pure, or faultless, but Jesus brings us and said, no, because of what I've done for them and their connection to me, they're holy, faultless, pure. Now, there's a little bit more to this, though, because it says, you must, of course, continue faithful on a firm and sure foundation, and must not allow yourselves to be shaken from the hope you gained when you heard the gospel. And it's this gospel that I, Paul, became a servant, and the gospel which is preached to everybody in the world. So there is a certain element that God has given us to take part in. We need to stay true. We need to stay faithful to Jesus Christ. We don't need to add all kinds of other parts of other religions to Christianity so that we're, Christian plus. And we don't add worldly philosophies or political ideologies and make that a key feature of our Christianity, because that, let's face it, kingdoms rise and fall, political systems rise and fall, but God is eternal. So he presents us, but at the same time, we have to continue. That leads us to our next passage, because as we continue, how do we continue? Well, Jesus talked about this too. In John chapter 15, he uses the image of a grapevine. Now, it's not really grape season right now. They might be harvesting some ice wine grapes if it gets cold enough right now, but that's about it. Here's Jesus' words in John 15, starting at the beginning in verse 1. I am the real vine, and my Father's the gardener. He breaks off every branch in me that does not bear fruit, and he prunes every branch that does bear fruit, so that it'll be clean and bear more fruit. You've been made clean already, talking to his disciples here, by the teaching I have given you. So this is good. They should be bearing fruit now. Remain united to me, and I will remain united to you. That's that relationship component with God that we need to have. Because a branch cannot bear fruit by itself. It can do so only if it remains in the vine. In the same way, you cannot bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am in the vine, and you are in the branches. Those who remain in me, and I in them, will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me. Whoever does not remain in me is thrown out like a branch that dries up, and such branches are gathered up and thrown into the fire where they are burnt. If, that's a challenging word for a lot of people, this is the word if, meaning that there's a part we get to play. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, then you'll ask her anything you wish, anything. Yeah, it's very specific here. Because if we're really connected to Jesus, we're going to be asking the kind of things he wants to see happen. And you'll have it. And my Father's glory is shown by you bearing much fruit. So we reflect God's glory when we're doing the actions and attitudes and character of Christ. When that's part of who we are, we actually reflect glory to God. And in this way, you become my disciples. I thought there already were disciples. No, in this way, by bearing fruit, showing you're a disciple. I love you just as the Father loves me. Remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I obeyed my Father's commands and so remain in his love. Jesus also says right here, I told you this so that my joy may be in you and it may be complete. My commandment is this, love one another just as I love you. And he goes on to talk about how the greatest commandment is that a person will lay down his life for his friends. And that's exactly what he does for us. And he, in verse 16 says, you didn't choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear much fruit, the kind of fruit that endures. And so my Father will give you whatever you ask for in my name. This then is what I command, love one another. So it's like, well, what sort of things should we be asking for? It's not easy to love one another. We need God the Father to answer that prayer for us. We need to pray, God, can you help me to love that person? We need to be paying attention and listening. In my case, sometimes I say, Lord, can you keep my mouth shut so I can just listen and be empathetic to people? It's not always my natural gifting, so I ask God to help me. And guess what? He does, and then I can reflect God to others. So here we have this point. Who is Advent? Let's just review. Who is Advent all about? Who is Christmas all about? Well, it's about Jesus. It's not just the baby born in a manger, though. This is about God who stepped into the story of humanity as one of us. Jesus experiencing everything from having dirty diapers changed to growing up, going through puberty, going into, that's an awkward thought, isn't it? But going through all those different things that we experience. He experienced joy. He experienced grief. We hear about Jesus losing one of his best friends, Lazarus. Jesus had friends, even that alone. He also had enemies. These are all parts of being a human. But he wasn't just that. He was also fully God at the same time, living amongst us, and he took the hit we all deserve. That's also a theme as we think about Christmas. We think about gifts often at Christmas. It's just the way we do things. And even when we see when Jesus was born, he received gifts, amazing gifts, even though they would actually absolutely useless for him as an infant. I mean, you can imagine Jesus like tipping over the bottle of myrrh and making everything stink. That's possibly what would have happened. No, his parents used those gifts and probably used it for them being in Egypt for several years. It wasn't like he got like gold toys. They just gave him gold. And to an infant, that's what an infant needs is its warmth and its mother and feeding. Like an infant has very specific needs, and gold, frankincense, and myrrh are not them. I don't know why I got on that, but hopefully that's blessing for you somehow. But we see gifts, but the ultimate gift of Christmas is not even these things, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It is Jesus Christ who came, entered history to change it. And then he died and was resurrected. And the Holy Spirit came and everything changed. The question today is are you connected to that who of Christmas? Because we can be. We can be connected to the God who created the heavens and the earth. Because he died for us. When we acknowledge our sin and we say, yes, I have blown it. I have not measured up to your standards. I can't even measure up to my own standards. But I turn to you, Lord. I turn to you and I make you Jesus number one in my life. And I want to stay faithful to that. Well, that's the who and the real gift of Christmas. Thanks for joining me. Hope you have a great week. God bless.